Hello, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, the podcast series where I get to dive much deeper into a speaker's ideas than is possible during their short TED Talk. And that is going to be especially important today because we're returning to a subject that is quite dense but endlessly fascinating. Consciousness. The experience we have of just being alive, the feeling of the sun on our skin, our emotions, the strange buzzing you hear in your ears right now, which would be my voice. If you heard the episode with Anil Seth recently, you'll know this is a big mystery for me and has been all my life. What's exciting about our guest today is that his theory of consciousness is really radical, as you'll hear. And arguably, it's going to take a truly radical idea if this mystery is ever to be solved. So I'm excited to introduce you to Professor Don Hoffman, author of a new book out called The Case Against Reality. In a recent TED Talk, he argues that what our consciousness perceives as the world around us, the trees, the wind, everything we make and experience, is almost certainly nothing like true reality.
Once we let go of our massively intuitive but massively false assumption about the nature of reality, it opens up new ways to think about life's greatest mystery. I bet that reality will end up turning out to be more fascinating and unexpected than we'd ever imagined.
So, what might that reality be? Well, we'll get a chance to talk about that. But first, we try to unpack the core mystery itself. Stick with us. We cover some complicated material in this episode, but I really think it offers a new way to gaze out at the world around you. It's a treat to get to sit down with you. Welcome, Don, to the TED Interview.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
So where to start? I guess we should start by defining even what we mean by consciousness. The word is used in so many different ways.
That's right. The problems of consciousness that I'm interested in studying come with the very, very simple kinds of consciousness. Just what is it like to taste coffee or smell garlic or hear the sound of a trumpet? We don't need to go to more exalted forms of consciousness like self-awareness or high states of consciousness to get the kinds of problems I'm interested in. I'm interested in the kinds of problems of what it might be like for a rat to taste cheese. That simple kind of problem already stops us.
Right. So when people use the word, I'm into raising consciousness, or in these sort of deeper societal senses, that we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about just the very fact that something can sense something, can feel something.
That's right. Just to see a color, to smell something, the very, very low sensory conscious experiences are already full of mystery to us as scientists.
So the fact that someone can see red in one way isn't a mystery. We have a whole story about how there's a specific wavelength of light that bounces off an object into the eye and creates that sensation of red. But it's in those last few words that is the mystery. What do you mean? Why a sensation?
Exactly right. So there are these tight correlations between brain activity and our conscious experiences. But of course, correlations are not a theory. We want to understand how the brain activity and the color experiences are related in terms of a scientific theory without waving our hands.
So give an example of why correlation is not necessarily an explanation.
Right. So a couple examples will really bring it home. So there's a strong correlation between rooster crows and sunrises. And if we stop there and we just say, look, there's correlations, sunrise and rooster crows are highly correlated. Well, that's not a theory, because one might think, well, the rooster crow causes the sun to rise, and we would be very, very deeply wrong. We think that there's a deeper explanation that has to be given beyond the correlations.
Although in that case, you could argue that the sunrise does cause the rooster to crow.
In that case, you could argue that the correlation implies this other direction of causation. So in the case of brain activity and our conscious experiences, the brain activity typically comes first, and the conscious experience comes later. For example, in experiments about our conscious experience of having made a free choice, in some experiments, you can actually have neural activity that predicts what the person is going to say, what choice they're going to report, several seconds before the person is consciously aware. So in that case, you might say, well, look, it's not just a correlation. The brain activity comes first, and the conscious experience comes later. So clearly that logically entails that the brain activity causes the conscious experience. And that's a fallacy. An example of this would be train stations. When you have dozens and dozens of people arriving at a train station, a few minutes later, a train appears. So nice correlation between people arriving and the people come first, the train comes later. Does that imply that the people arriving at the train station caused the train to appear? Absolutely not. If you tried to give a theory in which you explained how the people assembling there somehow caused the train to appear, you'd have a hard problem of trains. How is it that all the people assembling there caused the train to appear? You'd be scratching your head and wondering how that happened because you're missing that there's a deeper thing, a train schedule that's coordinating both.
Right, so in that case, neither is causing the other.
Exactly right.
They're both being caused by this deeper fact that you have to know about to understand this phenomenon.
Absolutely.
I mean, we can experience the interaction between the physical world and consciousness every minute of the day. Like you shut your eyes and suddenly everything goes away and you open them and where did all that come from? There's suddenly this world, and it seems to be usually the world that you expect. It's the same as the world that was there when you shut your eyes, implying that there is something external, objective there, right? But the riddle is why the experience? There's so many ways into this riddle. This is one way in. In terms of the biological functioning of organisms, there is a complete scientific story that doesn't seem to need anything to feel anything. You can understand a plankton swimming in the ocean and light comes and it swims in a particular direction, food comes and it will swim in another direction. There is causality there. As you work up the food chain, complexity increases, but there's no moment, it seems, where you have to say something radically different happened. You have creatures forming brains, but those are just electrical impulses connecting to, motor neurons, connecting to muscles. Like there seems to be a complete story there without having to embark on any reference to consciousness.
Absolutely. This is a good description of the hard problem. And so the question
Talk about the hard problem, actually. Define the hard problem versus the so-called easy problem.
That's right. So the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of specifying precisely with mathematical precision. It's a scientific theory that explains how consciousness could emerge. This was understood by Leibniz back in 1700. He clearly outlined the problem in his famous Leibniz Mill example. What Leibniz said was that you can imagine going into a physical system like the brain and shrinking yourself down and getting smaller and smaller so that the whole thing begins to look like a machine. Like you could be going inside a mill, which was a big machine they had back then. And you can see all the gears and all the moving parts. And he says there's nothing in all this machinery that would ever explain how a perception could ever come up. I mean, the leap from machinery and mechanism and motion to a conscious experience is a huge leap with no scientific connection that we could see. And Thomas Huxley also was very clear about it. He knew the brain physiology, and he said how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unexplainable as the appearance of a genie when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. It's magic, and despite all the success in neuroscience since Huxley, all the advancements we've made, it's still magic. We have no theory that dispels the magic. The correlations are sitting there staring us in the face. More correlations, hundreds of correlations, really good work about those correlations and specific conscious experiences. All this data and no compelling theories. I would put it quite simply, we have no idea how to start with unconscious ingredients and cook up consciousness. No idea.
So, I mean, we're talking here, I guess, about the mind-body problem that has troubled philosophers for hundreds, probably thousands of years. And a few hundred years ago, it was definitely possible to believe that we had these bodies that did their thing, and the inside they were kind of animated by these minds or souls that did their thing, and that we had this, these conscious choices and so forth. And there was this sort of dualism that was believed. So one belief about the relationship between mind and body is that there is this dualistic relationship. The body does some things, the mind does other things. That's made much harder to hold to because of seeing just how tightly every mental state is correlated with the brain activity. So the other choices are that the physical world just drives the mental world, right?
Right. And a number of people these days will say that, the hard problem is not a real problem. It was something that just sort of was invented by Descartes, and if we could just get rid of Descartes' framework, we wouldn't have the hard problem of consciousness. And I disagree with him on that, because I would say that, look, the problem is not what Descartes posed. The problem is we have these correlations between brain activity and conscious experiences, and those are hard data that need to be explained today. So forget Descartes' dualism. These are the data. Where's the scientific theory?
So I'm so puzzled as to how people listening to this now are going to be reacting. My experience of talking to people about consciousness is that about 2/3 of the people, at least who I speak to, just have zero interest in this topic. They don't feel the riddle. They don't feel it. So what's at stake here, Don? Because it seems like some scientists feel like not necessarily not that much is at stake. It's not that deep a problem, and yet to me, it's the most important question there is. It goes to who are we and what's life for and what's going to happen after death and all these sorts of questions. I think, depending on where you come out on it, sometimes it feels as if the single thing that we care most about, science doesn't have a story on, and that is deeply worrying, right?
It matters very, very deeply, because here is a place where our current scientific theories stop. They run into a barrier. And we've seen systematically in the past that is where we make progress in science. If we really look at the problems that are blocking us and take them very, very seriously, we get the radical new insights that are required to take the next step. We see this systematically in physics, for example. In the late 1800s, it was assumed that physics was pretty much done. Lord Kelvin said, if you're a smart guy, don't go into physics. It's pretty much wrapped up. They had a little problem with an experiment which didn't seem to show the speed of light changing due to the Earth movement, but that was not going to be a real big problem. Well, it turned out that was a big problem, and you shouldn't ignore these things that don't quite fit into your current scientific theory. Einstein picked up on that, and we got special relativity and general relativity. It was a huge breakthrough. And there were other problems that led to quantum mechanics. So here, the issue is, if we want a theory of everything in science, we can't leave out the most important thing to us, which is our very selves and our own conscious experiences. That can't be ignored. It's not trivial. It's very, very central. And if it's an illusion, we want a scientific theory that explains why the illusion is happening. We, as scientists in cognitive neuroscience, have come up with really detailed correlations between brain activity and conscious experiences, and no theory to explain them, and no way to really understand how to explain them. So that, for me as a scientist, this is exciting. It says we need new ideas that could radically transform our whole framework for doing science. And so this is not, for a scientist, by the way, the attitude is not, we need to preserve our current theories at all costs. Quite the opposite. Study the theories, understand the current state of science, and then take our theories and try to pit them against each other and break them. That's how you learn where our theories fail and where the new insights need to come.
What really struck me when I first came across you, Don, was a piece of writing you did in answer to a question on the internet. There's a website, edge.org, that does an annual question and asks a range of scientists and thinkers about it. This is what you wrote. You said, "Here are some obvious truths that guide current attempts to solve the mind-body problem." And by implication, some of these we're going to have to let go. Physical objects have causal powers. Neural activity can cause conscious experiences. The brain exists whether or not it is observed. So too does the moon and all other physical objects. Consciousness is a relative latecomer in the evolution of the universe. Conscious sensory experiences resemble or approximate true properties of an independently existing physical world. I mean, any one of those statements that someone listened to and thought about, they would go, yes, of course that's true. And in your thinking, you want to unpick several of these.
Yes. Well, each one of those assumptions seems to be just obviously true, and I would propose that each one of them is false, deeply false, and that is causing our problems.
Each one of them, wow.
Every one of them is false.
Do you want to start with that last one there, that conscious sensory experiences resemble or approximate true properties of an independently existing physical world? You've spent a lot of work on this.
Yeah. So I've been studying visual perception for a long time. Most of my colleagues assume that evolution by natural selection favors organisms that see the world more accurately. The idea is that those of our ancestors who saw the world more accurately had a competitive advantage compared to those who saw it less accurately. And thus they were more likely to pass on their genes that code for the more accurate perceptions. So after thousands of generations of that, we can be quite confident that we're the offspring of those who saw more accurately and we see more accurately. Of course, no one believes that we see all of reality. But we see those aspects of reality that are necessary for our survival, is the standard story. And we see those accurately. It's very compelling. When you put the argument that way, it seems like, well, of course, who could ever argue against it? And it's many of my colleagues who are very, very bright state that argument in various forms. And instead, what evolution has done, it's shaped us with a user interface. Here's another metaphor that's very, very useful. Think of your perceptions as a user interface. So suppose you're writing an email, and the icon for that email is blue and rectangular and in the middle of your desktop screen. Does that mean that the email itself in your computer is blue and rectangular and in the middle of the computer? Of course not. Anybody who thought that really misunderstands the whole point of the interface. The interface is there not to show us the truth, which in this metaphor is all the circuits and voltages and software inside the. If you had to toggle voltages to craft an email, your friends would never hear from you. It's just too much mess. So the point of the interface is to hide the truth in this metaphor. It's to hide the truth, but to give you eye candy, little symbols that are easy to deal with that allow you to control the reality, even if you're utterly ignorant about the nature of what that reality is. And that, I claim, is what evolution has done for us. In this interface, space and time as you perceive them, are a three-dimensional or four-dimensional desktop. 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. It's your desktop, and physical objects like a glass of water or an apple, a spoon, these are icons, 3-dimensional icons in this desktop. And pretty soon we'll have holographic interfaces on our laptops. You'll be having a 3-dimensional desktop and 3-dimensional icons. This will all seem quite natural as you have these icons that you can actually do lots of stuff with because they're now 3-dimensional, not just flat things. But that's what evolution gave us. It gave us an interface explicitly to hide the truth and to give us levers to control reality even though we're utterly ignorant about reality. And in this interface, we have a useful fiction of causality. I see a glass in front of me, I can take my hand and bump it, and it seems like my hand caused the glass to move. And for everyday life, that fiction is perfectly fine. It's a useful fiction. It guides my behavior and keeps me alive. And by the way, that's the point of the symbols that evolution has given us. You might say, well, look, Hoffman, if you think that train coming down the tracks at 200 miles an hour is just an icon in your interface, why don't you step in front of it? And I wouldn't step in front of the train for the same reason I wouldn't carelessly drag my blue icon to the trash can. Not because I take the icon literally. My file is not blue. But I do take it seriously. If I drag that icon to the trash, I could lose a lot of work. So we have to take our perceptions seriously. Evolution shaped us with perceptions to keep us alive. But that does not entitle us to take them literally.
I'd love to just hear about you. How long have you been thinking about these issues, Don, and what drew you into taking this on full time? Tell us a bit about your story.
Yes, I was drawn to this issue as a teenager. I was a fairly geeky teenager, and I had very interesting pressures on me. My father was a minister in a Protestant fundamentalist kind of church, and so on the weekends I got one kind of story, which was very, very you have to believe this, and the earth is only so many thousand years old, and so forth. And then in my science classes, and reading some philosophy. I was reading some existentialism and so forth. I was getting a very different framework, and they were quite contradictory. And so I decided that I really wanted to understand who we are. For me, the question boiled down to, are we just machines? Right? It seemed from the work I was reading in artificial intelligence and physicalist theories that we're just machines. And on the other hand, there's this the personal experience that we seem to be more than just machines. And I decided that was really an interesting, who am I? What kind of creatures are we? So the science and religion thing really caught me in a pincher there, and I really wanted to understand. Maybe they both had a piece of the puzzle, maybe both were wrong. I wanted to study. And so I found the work of David Marr. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I found the work of David Marr at MIT using artificial intelligence and mathematics to really study how visual perception works. And I was interested in the bigger questions, but I understood that you really need to build your tools. Before you can take on the big questions, you need to spend a few years on smaller problems really to learn how to work on it. And so I went to MIT and worked with Marr and Whitman Richards and on artificial intelligence and human vision. And then after a few years of doing that, I stepped back again and asked, okay, what am I learning here? And one of the first things I learned was part of the problem here is going to be we're assuming that we see reality as it is. And my work on perception was beginning to indicate to me, even in the mid-1980s, I was beginning to realize that the models were saying maybe we don't have to see reality as it is. It took me another 20 years to actually get the evolutionary argument against it. But already I was getting a hint that maybe that assumption is the wrong assumption. Maybe there is something deeper here.
I mean, this is challenging material you're putting in front of us here. I just want to put some context here, which is what to connect how this conversation we're having right now relates to the broader conversation about the hard problem of consciousness. So you spoke earlier about the train timetable example of how just because things are correlated doesn't mean that one of them causes the other. There might be a whole other thing that is causing both. And without putting too much of a spoiler on it, I think your belief about our world is that we are missing a much deeper physical reality that causes both the physical world and our conscious experiences. And so part of your argument here is to dismantle the notion that the physical world that we think we see actually is the deepest reality. And you've got some powerful arguments. But is that's basically the link here between the two parts of the conversation?
That is the structure of my argument. Most of my colleagues assume that space-time and physical objects are fundamental. Things like neurons exist, whether or not they're perceived, and they have causal powers, and somehow neural activity or matter more generally with the right causal properties will somehow create or be conscious experiences. And what I'm doing is saying our assumption that there is a physical world, that space-time is fundamental, really is motivated because that's the way we see the world. Our perceptual systems show us a world of space and time and physical objects, and we assume that, therefore, objective reality really is spatiotemporal and has physical objects, that neurons really do exist. I mean, you can look through the microscope, I look through the microscope, we both agree that we see a neuron, so therefore the neuron exists, and therefore the neurons are the source of the causality of consciousness.
One way of trying to explore it is imagining that we're all living in a giant video game. I don't think this is your ultimate theory, but if you play with that idea for a minute and say that basically we're living in this world of computer code, but in that world there is actually a huge amount of detailed structure. So it might be that you're playing this driving game and a rock rolls down a mountain next to you, and unless you avoid it, your life is over, it's terminated. Nonetheless, to say that rock that you see is actually this big thing is absurd. It's actually, no, it's computer code. And
That's right.
And so you're saying that the railway schedule behind the causality of the trains leaving and the passengers leaving is this deeper reality that is causing all of these experiences. In the analogy I've just given, that would be computer code, the computer code that set up that whole reality.
Right. The analogy of virtual reality is a very, very good one here. So in virtual reality, you could be having a multiplayer virtual reality. I'm driving my car, and we're both trying to chase somebody else. So someone in China, in their virtual reality, could be playing with me, and we could both say, look, there's another car. Let's go chase them together. And so we're both talking about the same car. We can both talk about the car. Of course, there's no real car there that we're both chasing. And I can turn and look to the side, and I don't see the car anymore. I turn back, I see the car. And so you might think, well, every time I look over there, I see the car, so therefore the car really exists. But obviously in the virtual reality example, it doesn't. Every time you look in that direction, you get pixels to your headset, and you then create the three-dimensional perception of that car. And I'm claiming that's what happens in everyday life. I look at this glass in front of me. I'm constructing the three-dimensional object in real time. I look away, and I don't construct it. I garbage, as we say in computer science, we garbage collect it. We throw that data away because we don't need it. We're trying to save memory. I look back and I create the cup again.
But you can't be just creating it yourself. Whatever that hidden reality is, it's unbelievably detailed in its effectiveness. I mean, the glass of water, if it's an icon, it's a pretty amazing icon because it's not just something you see, it's something you feel, it's something you can taste. If we walk out the room and come back, the glass is still there. If you drink it, there's a whole scientific story about how that gives you life. It feels like if there is, whatever deeper story there is, integrates with the world that we believe we see at an unbelievable level, that there is something else external to me coding for that glass at the very least, surely?
Yes. So I'm not a solipsist. So solipsists are people who claim that there's nothing out there except my experiences. I'm the only thing that exists, me and my experiences. I'm going to say that there is an objective reality out there, and it's independent of whether I observe it and whether you observe it. But that reality is not spatial temporal. It's not about space and time. It's not physical objects. It's something very much deeper. And it's when we interact with that deeper reality that evolution has shaped us to create this user interface that's much, much simpler. It seems complicated to us. I mean, this is really a three-dimensional world with all these cups and, plants and so on. It's really, really complicated, but it's much, much simplified compared to the deeper reality. And from an evolutionary point of view, most of my colleagues would say that I see a cup because I've been shaped by evolution to see the truth, and there really is a cup there. I take it differently. I see a cup from an evolutionary point of view because I've been shaped to try to understand fitness payoffs.
All right, so let's do that. Give me an example of where evolution might create a trick that would serve the interests of the creature that it had evolved for, but that did not comport to reality, was not a match for reality.
Yes, one of my favorite is the jewel beetle in Australia. This beetle is dimpled and glossy and brown, and the females are flightless. The males fly, looking, of course, for eligible females, and when he finds one, he alights and mates. But in the outback of Australia, there's also another species, Homo sapiens, and the males of that species like full beer bottles, and they're not interested in empties, and they throw the empties out into the outback. And some of them are dimpled, glossy, and just the right shade of brown to catch the fancy of the male jewel beetles. And they were found swarming all over these beetles trying to mate. So they're crawling all over the bottles, full-bodied contact with the bottles, and unable to figure out that this is not a real female. The species almost went extinct. The males had been successfully mating with females for hundreds of thousands of years. You would think that means that natural selection gave them a true understanding of what a real female is, and it's not the case. What evolution apparently gave these beetles was a little trick, a hack. A female is anything dimpled, glossy, and brown, and apparently, in this case, the bigger the better. So it's not that we see the truth. We have these simplified heuristics that just tell us how to behave in ways that will allow us to reproduce. So it's not about seeing the truth. In fact, there are selection pressures to do things as cheaply as possible. Every calorie that you spend on perception is a calorie you have to go out, kill something and eat it to get that calorie. And that's very, very costly. So there are selection pressures to do things very, very cheaply. And so we use tricks and hacks. But it's even worse than that. It's not only that we have to do things on the cheap, it's that the payoff functions that govern evolution themselves don't contain information about the truth of the world. I'll put it this way. It's like, think about evolution as like a video game. You're in a video game, and you're chasing points as hard as you can, trying to grab points here and there. And if you get enough points, you get to the next level. If you don't, you die and you lose your money. Evolution is like that, except what we're doing is we're chasing fitness payoffs. Those are the points that we're chasing, fitness payoffs. Mm-hmm. And you don't get to the next level. It's your genes, your offspring get to the next level in the game. But it's very much analogous. Evolution shaped us not to see the truth, but to have a user interface that keeps us alive. That's the only thing that matters, keeps us alive long enough to reproduce. And so our assumption that we're seeing the truth, that when we look through microscopes and see neurons, that we're seeing the truth, that's a problem. We're just seeing our interface symbols. And I would say this, it's not simply that we're getting things off a little bit in our perceptions, that I'm getting the color of the glass a little or the shape of it a little bit off. It's rather, it's more profound. It's that the very language of space and time and physical object shapes and colors and motions is simply the wrong language to describe objective reality. You couldn't possibly frame a true description of objective reality in that language. If I were a computer science professor and you were in my class and I said, I want you to describe how a computer really works, all the circuits inside there, but you can only use the language of the pixels on your desktop. That's the only language you can use. Well, good luck. That's the wrong language. You couldn't possibly describe how the computer works in that language. And that's the problem that we have. When we use space and time and matter inside space and time as the fundamental language, we've gotten the wrong language to even describe objective reality. And that's why the hard problem has become impossible.
Okay, so I guess this is the big question is, what are the possibilities for what might really be there behind this 3D interface that we live in?
Well, the right answer is, of course, that I'm not sure, that I don't know. But as a scientist, we have to try. We have to try and propose theories, try to make testable hypotheses and see where the theories go. And so here's my motivation for the direction that I'm going. It's the hard problem of consciousness. Again, we have all the correlations between what we call the physical world, the brain and its activity, and our conscious experiences. We've been trying to start with the physical world and somehow boot up our conscious experiences from activities of the physical world. That has failed so far, and we have no idea how to boot up consciousness from unconscious ingredients. So my idea is quite simple. Let's try the other direction. Let's start with a theory of consciousness on its own terms, not as somehow emergent from a pre-existing physical world, but literally presuppose that the nature of objective reality really is, in some sense, to be fleshed out with a science, consciousness. So we need a mathematically precise model of what we mean by consciousness on its own terms, and then the goal would be to show how what we call space-time and matter, the physical world, emerges from this pre-existing realm of consciousness. So once again, it's going to be a scientific theory in which our assumptions are as simple and unified as possible. I'll just give a big picture, and then we can go into the details if you want.
Let's try it.
So I'll have this thing that I call conscious agents. So it's a mathematical thing, but we can think of it intuitively as conscious agents. You're a conscious agent, I'm a conscious agent. But conscious agents don't need to have a self. They're very, very simple consciousnesses. They have experiences and they can take simple actions. But we can think of the universe as a network, a big, vast social network of interacting conscious agents, an infinite number of them. So think of Twitter. You have hundreds of millions of Twitter users, perhaps, or tens of millions at least, and hundreds of millions or billions of tweets going on, and it's really complicated. Any given Twitter user would be overwhelmed. If they're trying to understand what's really going on in the Twitterverse, it would be overwhelming. So what you need is a visualization tool. Like the big data people are doing this all this big data, it's overwhelming. How do you understand it? Well, you have these visualizations. You simplify, you put it into a visual format that you can understand and see. And that's what space and time and physical objects are. We're in a realm of conscious agents, this vast social network. It's overwhelming. I'm just a finite little agent. I can't see it all. And so I have this little user interface, a visualization tool for dealing with this Twitterverse. And that's what we call the physical world. So the big picture will be reality is a network of conscious agents where they're all mathematically defined. Their dynamics can be precisely specified. And what we call the physical world happens to be the user interface, the visualization tool that some of these conscious agents use, but it's not the only one possible. In this framework, different conscious agents could use very, very different user interfaces. Some could be, maybe they have a 4-dimensional or 10-dimensional user interface. We're only using 3. Maybe the notion of dimension is simply the wrong notion for their interface. Maybe they don't use color. They use other experiences that we don't.
So this is different from a view that some other radical thinkers in the space have. That some people who've looked at this problem have said the only way to understand consciousness is to assume that it's embedded in everything in the universe. And they have this view of panpsychism, which in most versions of it that I've heard is that there is some kind of consciousness associated with every physical element in the world. An atom has some level of consciousness to it, probably not very deep, but some level. And that as matter comes together in ever more elaborate forms, so consciousness comes together, but that it kind of goes all the way down. That this is not what you're proposing. You're proposing something more fundamental than that, I think, which is that that view of panpsychism still seems to start with atoms and electrons and forces and attaches consciousness as an integral piece to it. You're saying, no, it's actually put the consciousness first. Reality at its heart is this very complex sea of conscious agents interacting with each other. And they have built the physical world that we see, it is a creation of consciousness.
That's right.
So this sea of conscious agents, you're saying some of them could be really, really simple, but they're all experiencing something.
Yes.
In order to create something as sophisticated and complex as our physical universe, I mean, it seems like a lot of those agents have a pretty, I don't know, boring life. Like huge numbers of them, you would think, would have to be dedicated to ensuring that thousands of humans all have exactly the same experience when they go to visit a particular rock or table or movie or whatever. And to ensure consistency, the kind of scientific consistency and predictability of the world. Intuitively, it's a little baffling to me to picture how a sort of a sea of interconnected conscious agents could possibly do that. Help me with that intuition.
Yes. Good point first about some of them have very, very simple experiential worlds and they seem pretty austere. In fact, in this theory, there are agents that have only 2 experiences possible to them. And so you can actually build up more and more complicated agents by their interactions. When agents interact, it turns out the mathematics says you get a new agent. And so by the time you get to a person, there's this huge network of agents, quadrillions upon quadrillions of agents in a vast network, all interacting in a complicated dynamical system. And that all is combining to create the agent that I would call me. There's countless agents going all the way down to these very simple agents that are all having a dynamics that works together to create me.
How does your theory relate to what we actually see in the world? Like, has it changed how you react with other entities that you believe to be conscious? For example, animals or other objects.
Great question. So I think a good analogy here is, or a good example, is just to look in the mirror. So if you look at your own face in the mirror, what do you see? You just see skin, hair, and eyes. But you know firsthand when you look in the mirror that what you don't see is far richer. The world of your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your fears, your love of music, the itch that you have, the headache that you have. There's this rich world of conscious experiences that you know firsthand is hidden behind the veneer of your face. And we believe when we look at other people and we see their face, we believe that, of course, we're not seeing all of them. We're just seeing their face. When I see someone smile, I can guess that they're probably happy. But a smile does not resemble happiness. If you think about it, a smile is a smile. We use it systematically to infer a conscious experience of another person. So the way I think about it is that our user interface, this space-time interface that we have, gives us certain symbols, like bodies and faces, that are a portal into this pre-existing realm of conscious agents. So I'm not saying literally that your face and your body are conscious. I'm saying that the face and body that I see when I look at you are symbols that I create in my interface, but they're pointing to a realm of your conscious experiences, and they're pointing truly, but it's clouded. I mean, there's a lot that's going on inside of you that I'll never know. So our interface, when we see a person, it gives us a portal into this realm of conscious agents. When I look at my cat, I have another portal into a pre-existing realm of conscious agents, but it's dimmer. I can guess that my cat likes this kind of food and not that kind of food. I can guess that when I'm petting it, it likes it until it says, okay, that's enough. I can get, but it's dimmer. When I look at an ant, my interface is really not giving me much insight into a realm of consciousness behind it. And when I see something that I call a rock, I've given up. No surprise, I have a finite interface. It's an infinite social network of conscious agents I'm trying to visualize. My interface has to give up. It has to ignore most of that reality of interacting conscious agents. That whole vast social network, I'm getting just a little portal into little bits of it. When I give up, I'm not getting any insight into the consciousness behind. And here's the problem. We mistake a limit of our interface for an insight into the nature of reality. That's what physicalism does. We look at the smallest levels, we see atoms and rocks and matter. It doesn't look conscious. And we say, because it doesn't look conscious to me, therefore the fundamental nature of reality is not consciousness. That's a fundamental mistake. We're mistaking a limit of our interface for an insight into reality.
But the actual agents themselves, like how do you think of them? Like at the simplest level. So a conscious agent, it's a world of this sort of countless millions. I think you said an infinite number of conscious agents. At the simplest level, things like I feel light or I feel dark, or I sense red, I don't sense red. There's all these different sort of binary pieces that can gradually come together in a more sophisticated consciousnesses, and you're trying to figure out the mathematics for how that happens.
Exactly right. We're working out the mathematics for how that all integrates. So, and we, as I mentioned, we have the mathematical tools that show us that this is all computationally possible. These networks of conscious agents are computationally universal. So anything that we could program with neural networks, like deep learning networks, convolutional neural networks, we can do it with conscious agent networks. So the tools are there. We know we can do it, but it's a new architecture. It's a whole new area of network inquiry.
And I guess the hope is that you can find some moment where you can use this to make a prediction that traditional science never got to. That is the hope, that if you can do that, if you can say that based on this mathematical model,
right,
therefore, if we looked here, we would see something that science would never have predicted. That's the moment that you're looking for somehow?
Absolutely. With the theory of conscious agents, I would love to get the theory far enough along that we could make new predictions about how consciousness works. One prediction I would say is this. When I give a class on Introduction to Psychology, I'll have 400 or 500 students in the class, and at some point I'll always say to them, what's standard in the field, 99.99% of our mental processes are unconscious. But strictly speaking, what I'm saying is that's not true. All of my mental processes are conscious, just not conscious to me. I have my own user interface. I can't possibly deal with all the consciousnesses that combine together to form me. So I represent them through an interface, my body, my emotions, my biology, my physiology, my chemistry, my physics. So I say that it's unconscious because it's unconscious to me, and then I make the mistake of assuming that the way I see the world is the way it really is. So it really is unconscious, that there's nothing conscious going on there. So that's one implication, is that when we really understand, we will find that it's consciousness all the way down. There are no such thing as, strictly speaking, unconscious mental processes, only ones that are unconscious to me.
So I'm struck by the ambition level of this project, and by, I guess I would say, by your courage in putting it out there. I mean, in the scientific world, can be pretty unforgiving of there's a line where people are being speculative, and then they've kind of gone too far. How many of your colleagues have you been able to persuade that you may be onto something? How many think that you've lost the plot?
I would say that most of my colleagues, when they first hear me talking about this, just assume I've lost the plot right up front. But if I sit down with them for a long period of time and we talk things over and we really go over our failure to solve the hard problem of consciousness, then they realize that radical rethinking is going to be required of deep assumptions. And I think the thing that really gets people, my colleagues, to think twice are my evolutionary arguments. I mean, that's why I focused on that. I was actually talking about this kind of idea in the late 1990s, but without evolution. And I was dismissed because I didn't have the evolutionary arguments. But now I have a theorem with a friend, Chetan Prakash, where we prove that organisms that see reality as it is are never more fit than organisms of equal complexity that see none of reality and are just tuned to fitness. And what that means is that the language of our perception, space-time and physical objects, is almost surely the wrong language to describe reality. So that's the showstopper for my colleagues. When I have that theorem on the table, then they realize, okay, unless they can try to counter that theorem, there's something that has to be taken seriously here.
In terms of your work, I mean, you're pursuing with an attempt at real sort of mathematical precision to build out this deeper theory of how this network of conscious agents could look like. That would be the home run. Right. You'd also be excited just to persuade people that to rethink their assumptions about the world that we see, and that we will not solve this problem of consciousness until we're really willing to do that at a radical level.
Absolutely. My theory about the ultimate nature of reality could be wrong. In fact, I should bet against myself. I mean, if you look at the history of scientific theories, and scientific thought more generally, we're very consistent. We're consistently wrong, and there's no reason for us to expect that we necessarily have the tools intellectually to solve this problem, right?
So talk about that. Why might that be so?
Right. Well, we don't expect that monkeys have the concepts needed to understand quantum mechanics. And from an evolutionary point of view, we're just another species, Homo sapiens, and there's no real fundamental reason why we should assume that we have the concepts needed to solve this hard problem of consciousness. I mean, I hope we have the tools, but I can't prove from an evolutionary point of view that we would. Now, from my own framework of what I call conscious realism, in which consciousness is fundamental, since I am a conscious agent, there is some hope within that framework that because I am a conscious agent, I'm not ultimately divorced from the true nature of reality, and therefore I might have within my own framework a self-consistent framework in which we might be able to understand, maybe not exhaustively, but truly.
And so to what extent, Don, has this journey you've been on reconciled your religious roots with your scientific passion? I mean, talk about death, life after death. When you die, the physical parts of your brain that are the current correlates of your consciousness get dispersed at some point. Does that mean that the consciousness is dissolved? What is the range of possibilities there? Right.
So this has led me to rethink the relationship of science and spirituality. And I think that spiritual traditions, they ask a lot of really important questions, and science brings very rigorous methods that we can use to try to address them. And in a physicalist framework, it's pretty clear that if your brain causes consciousness and your brain dies, then your conscious experiences are gone. It's a clear implication of that. So there's really no survival of consciousness. In this interface theory, it's very interesting. It opens up a possibility that I want to explore. And the possibility is like this. Suppose you go with some friends to a virtual reality arcade and you put on helmets and headsets and bodysuits to play like virtual volleyball on the beach. And so you put on your headset and bodysuit, and there's sand and a net and palm trees, and your friends start playing volleyball with you, and then one of them, say, your friend Tom, after a while says, I'm thirsty, I need a drink. And so he takes off his headset and bodysuit to go get a drink, and his avatar collapses on the sand. Well, within the virtual reality, he's effectively dead. But he's not really dead. He's just stepped out of the interface. And that's a possibility that I want to explore in my framework. Consciousness is fundamental. Space-time and matter is just our interface. Is death simply a consciousness stepping out of the interface so that I'm no longer in contact with it? I don't know, because it's an open mathematical question. Can consciousnesses really fundamentally dissolve in the theory or not? I think that they won't, but it leaves open the possibility. I'm going to be exploring the mathematics, but it opens up a hope where there isn't any in the other. But if it comes out that there's no survival, then there's no survival. I'll find out what the mathematics says. The math is smarter than the scientist who writes it down, and that's why we do scientific theories.
I don't think the podcast is the right place to go into the math. Where can someone who wants to explore the actual mathematical approach you're taking, where can they go?
I have a couple papers that are published with the mathematics in peer-reviewed journals. If you just Google Donald Hoffman, my homepage comes up, and my Vita has links. And
you're continuing to try and build this mathematical theory with collaborators, or is this a solo effort?
I have Chetan Prakash, who is a collaborator, Chris Fields, Manish Singh, and Federico Fagin are among my collaborators right now we're all collaborating together. Also, Mauro Dariano, trying to put together a mathematical model of consciousness that's absolutely precise. And by the way, we're being precise not because I think we're right, but so that we can find out precisely why we're wrong, and as quickly as possible. That's the point of science, is to be mathematically precise.
Okay, so much food for thought there, Don. I'm guessing sometimes it feels like a slightly lonely furrow, but do you feel like you're making progress, you're winning people over?
I feel like the younger generation is getting it, and that they will get it when they spend time in virtual reality, and then they take the headset off and realize that the world that they were in was just as compelling and immersive as the world when they take the headset off. For many of them, it's going to be a no-brainer. I suspect in 30 or 40 years, they'll look back at this period and go, how come those people didn't get it? They'll look back at us like we look at people coming across the West in covered wagons. It's sort of like, how come they couldn't understand that your perceptions are just your perceptions? Even if it's immersive, it doesn't mean it's the truth. So I have good hopes for the next generation. And when I talk, the older generation, my generation has lots of reservations. The younger generation is really open to it. So I'm really quite hopeful.
One last seed you'd like to plant in people's consciousnesses?
Well, I would say we don't see reality as it is. This is just user interface. And what's behind the interface is the brand new realm of exploration for science.
Don Hoffman, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Don Hoffman is a professor of cognitive science at the University of California. If you're interested in learning more about the study of consciousness, check out our recent episode with Anil Seth, and make sure you watch Don Hoffman's TED Talk at TED.com. We'd also love to hear from you. Tell us about what you think of the show by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Chris Anderson. Thanks for listening. This week's show was produced by Lacey Roberts at Transmitter Media. Our production manager is Roxanne High-Lash. Our show is mixed by David Herman. Our theme music by Alison Leighton Brown. Special thanks to my colleague Michelle Quint. And thank you for listening. On the next episode, Frances Frey. She's behind the cultural makeovers at controversial companies like Uber and WeWork. We talk about the 3 pillars of good leadership culture and why her goal as a leader is to make herself completely obsolete.
I have no chance of unleashing you if I can't build a trusting relationship with you. So I both have to have you have faith in my authenticity, logic, and empathy, but I have to teach you how to have other people have faith in your authenticity, empathy, and logic. So really understanding how to build trust.
That's next week on the TED Interview.